Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. And today on the Fox Page, we are branching out. You regular listeners will not be surprised to hear that we are dipping a toe into television. We did this once before when we talked about Deadwood, the novel by Pete Dexter, and how incredibly well it was adapted for television into the television series of the same name. Today, we're going to talk about the much anticipated television adaptation of The Perfect Couple. You all know that I love television. I have said this over and over. I've also said that if it were not my job, that I don't know how I would ever find time to read, because honestly, there is so much great television. We also know that Ellen Pompeo of Grey's Anatomy fame is developing the Paradise Trilogy. One of the, I think it's called like Winter Street or something. I don't quote me on that, but it definitely begins with one of the winter books. I have never read an Hilderbrand winter book, so I'm very excited about reading that. For those of you who are wondering whether or not you should read the book before you watch the television, the answer is if you're someone like me who doesn't read for plot and who forgets everything as soon as she reads it, it's no problem. You can go ahead and read that book because, it's beginning of August right now. By the time I see the show in September, I will have totally forgotten. But if you are someone who's going to be really interested in the question of who committed the murder that occurs at the beginning of this, then obviously do not read the book. I don't know, I have no idea how closely the television show is going to hew to the plot of the book, but obviously if you are someone who's invested in plot, you should not in fact read the book. When I heard Elin Hilderbrand's The Perfect Couple was going to be adapted for television, I got so excited about the idea of doing this lecture, and once I dug in, I realized it's even more exciting than I thought. There are so many aspects of this novel that will translate so incredibly well onto the small screen. Now, a couple of very important notes as we start out here. I will obviously not be spoiling anything about The Perfect Couple in case you have not read the book. I'm very curious about the fact that there is a very, very large readership of this book. Elin Hilderbrand, she is known as the Queen of the Beach Read, and she has her legions of Hilderbabes out there. So, it's very easy to figure out exactly what happens to the person who is murdered in the very first pages of this novel. Another very important note is the fact that I have not seen the television. Unfortunately, I am not someone who's getting screeners or getting any, I don't even know if that exists. I like to think that all of the secrets of The Perfect Couple television adaptation are under lock and key, and nobody knows, aside from the all-star cast, nobody has a good sense of how they are going to spin out Elin Hilderbrand's story. But I am going to be making some conjecture today based on the trailer and also based on the cast list. So there have been lots of speculation, lots of articles, everything from IndieWire to Vanity Fair to BuzzFeed to the Nantucket Current. All of these different outlets have made their own sort of guesses as to what might happen in this adaptation, and I'm going to be adding to that body of speculation. I will also say, though, after really perusing some serious IMDb pages, IMDb, I think I'm coming out with as replete an idea of the show as I can. There were two articles that I read that talked about the fact that the bride's family is not a part, and that is one of the major changes that has been made. But if you were someone who looked very closely at the cast list, you would see that the bride's family is included. So what we are going to do today is take a look at the very best of what Elin Hilderbrand does, and also some not so hot things that she does, mostly though just the very best things she does. And we're going to talk about all of the ways that those excellent prose stylings will adapt themselves so well to television. So here at the Fox Page, we have in fact looked at two of her books. We looked at Summer of '69 last summer, and then we looked at Swan Song earlier this summer. So famously, Swan Song, as the name would suggest, is her last one of these Nantucket novels. I have already forgotten if it's 26 or 24, but she has lots and lots of them. She's 54 years old, maybe 55. Her birthday might be in July. But for the past, 26 or 24 years, she has written one Nantucket book a year, and they're much anticipated and much lauded. And I will say that I count her as a really good writer. She is someone whose prose, it's somewhat formulaic, but that can be very satisfying. For someone who is writing, in what is, in fact, a genre, she really hits all the marks and does it really, really well. But today we're talking about The Perfect Couple. This was a book that was published in 2018. In 2019, right away, it was optioned or purchased or whatever by Fox. And then in 2022, the series was greenlit by Netflix. So I don't know what happened between 2019 and 2022. COVID happened. Maybe that's, partially what we're talking about here. And the rights to the book went from Fox to Netflix. Elin has said a couple of times recently in articles about The Perfect Couple that her patience has paid off and that this is going to be a really excellent adaptation. So you get the sense, and I was surprised, in fact, that this was the first adaptation, but you get the sense that she has very high standards for what she wants this adaptation to look like. I think it's interesting that here, upon her retirement from these Nantucket books, she says she's retired. She's hung up the bikini is one of these cute lines that came up in a lot of the headlines about her retirement. But she is, in fact, continuing to write. She is going to write with her daughter. I'm very curious. We'll take a look at it here at the Fox page, but I'm very curious what this new venture is going to look like. I also have a sense that Elin, in her retirement or semi-retirement, has been very involved. She is an executive producer of The Perfect Couple, and I think has been very thoughtful about the kind of adaptation she would like to see. So in 2022, Netflix has access to it. It gets greenlit. In 2023, between April and June, is when the incredible all-star cast was shooting this television series. They did the shooting on Cape Cod, in Chatham and in Harwich. There's an amazing photograph of like the police station in Harwich, and it has like this little like front piece that is kind of stuck onto it that says like Nantucket Police Department or something. If you're looking on the YouTube, I'll post that picture so you can see it. Importantly, the writers' strike in Hollywood began in May. So, thank God they just finished the filming right before the writers' strike began. And then, 6 weeks after that, SAG-AFTRA, the Actors Guild, in the middle of July, they struck. And then the writers came back to work in late September, and the actors came back in the beginning of November. It's interesting to me that the writers' strikes and the actor strikes were so short. It seemed to me like it went on forever, probably because I love television so much and I was so worried. I was like, oh my God, what if this drags on forever and we don't have any more great television? I am, by the way, also very pro-union, and I was very happy that these unions got some of what they were really pushing for. Also, one very juicy note, the production team went to Nantucket in order to do some sort of B-roll shots, sort of establishing shots and all of the background shots. They took a bunch of shots on like Main Street and a couple of other streets in Nantucket. And the SAG-AFTRA union folks picketed because, in fact, there were background actors. And as far as SAG-AFTRA is concerned, those jobs should have been done by people who were in the union. But I love the fact that there was, that the Nantucket Enquirer and Mirror and the Nantucket Current had small articles. But it is important to recognize that this was something that kind of straddled those strikes. And in fact, we're very lucky, I think, that it has come out this quickly. We're now going to go ahead and dig on into the novel, The Perfect Couple, and all the many ways that I think it's going to translate so incredibly well onto the small screen. So first of all, any beach read and any kind of escapist genre, and certainly, Elin Hilderbrand is the queen of the beach read, that sort of book is meant to transport you. It's meant to deliver you to a place that is, in this case, summery and beachy, and is really evocative of relaxation and fun, and in this case, a bit of murder. But a book like that, almost by definition, is going to be very visual. So one of the things I liked right at the beginning is this notion of how a book that is very visual is a really good template for something that is in fact a visual medium. So obviously books are not a visual media. It's language that we are having to imagine in our brains, which is just an absolute miracle. But in fact, television, they're going to do all of the imagining for you. What I love is that all of that rich, detailed visual text that Elin has written for us is going, I think, to be incredible. And she is so good at description. I had a writing teacher once who critiqued a piece of mine. This was way back in my MFA days. And he said that I was using the Architectural Digest style of description. And to me, that sounded like a compliment. I was like, wow, that sounds great. Thank you. But in fact, he was not wild about that, didn't like this idea of kind of listing things, and didn't like the idea, certainly, of naming things by brand or spending too much time, describing a room in which someone is sitting. And for my money, the Elin Hilderbrand books really derive some of their real strength from the fact that she does this very, very well. One of the most obvious and, in fact, the most visual things that the book and the television series will share is the fact that they are set on Nantucket Island. So this is a very specific island. It's not too far off of Cape Cod. It's part of Massachusetts. It's very small. It's near Martha's Vineyard, which is larger and a little more liberal politically. I think people think of Nantucket, and I think it is this way, as being very moneyed, very waspy, very crusty New England Yankee, kind of thing in terms of its underpinnings, but also is really crowded in the summers because, in fact, there is this enormous tourist population because, in fact, it is a very popular summer destination. So you see Nantucket in both the trailer and also certainly in all of her books. So she does this incredible thing where she describes the island so, so well. And there's zillions and zillions of little teeny tiny details. And one of the things, she worried at some point about like not being able to write another great book. But this is the fourth of the novels of hers that I have read. And there is so much new information every single time about Nantucket. Of course, in our 6-episode television series, each of those episodes lasting 1 hour, we aren't going to have all of the details about the island, but they will be absolutely choice details chosen by the set decorators, and also, of course, simply by the fact that it is set in Harwich and in Chatham, which are towns that, in terms of architecture, look very much like Nantucket. So I want to dig into the novel. We're not going to read a ton from the book today. A lot of this is just going to be me sort of riffing, but we are going to look at some of the best examples of things that will translate directly from the page to the television show. So the first is a description of Nantucket, which in some ways is very similar to what we see in the trailer. One of the really smart things and one of the very sort of writerly things that Elin Hilderbrand does is she has the first descriptions of Nantucket Island. They come from the ferry. They come from a person who is arriving. She is the mother of the bride. She's arriving with her husband, the father of the bride, and they have never been to Nantucket before. And this is a really great way to very organically and very naturally have really rich description of a place. And it's seen through the eyes of an outsider who is noticing all of these little details. And it's very logical that the person would be, looking for these details and taking them in and really seeing them very vividly. So this is a very good way to do it. I think honestly in the trailer it's just like a lot of drone footage. You're far away, which is in fact very much like Karen, who is the mother of the bride. She's arriving, she's coming in on the ferry, she's coming closer and closer to the island. It's very much like that drone footage, where we have images very far away from these gray shingled houses with the white trim, and then we get closer and closer to them. So here is one of the descriptions of when Karen is just arriving on Nantucket. This is, in fact, when she is arriving at their house, which is very much like the trailer when we very first see Nicole Kidman walking out of the house. This is Karen driving up to the house. Summerland, a sign says, private. Karen peers out the window. There's a row of hydrangea bushes on either side of the driveway, alternately fuchsia and periwinkle, and then they drive under a boxwood arch into what Karen can only think of as some kind of waterfront utopia. There's a main house, stately and grand, with crisp white and green awnings over the windows. Opposite the main house are 2 smaller cottages, set amid landscape gardens with gurgling stone fountains and flagstone paths and lavish flower beds. And all of this is only yards away from the water. The harbor is right there, and across the flat blue expanse of the harbor is town. Karen can pick out the church towers she saw from the ferry, the Nantucket skyline. She has a hard time finding air, much less words. This is the most beautiful place she has ever been. It's so beautiful, it hurts. So, one of the really excellent things that Ellen Hilderbrand does in almost all of her novels is there really is something for everyone. We're going to talk about this a bit later when we talk about the wide swath of characters that we definitely see in the novel and that I hope we will see, and I think we will see in the series. So, amidst this sort of wide group of people, often you'll have an older woman who is, trying to reinvent herself in her 50s, which is very like Ellen. Then we will have, youngsters in their 20s getting up to all sort of 20-year-old kind of stuff. Sometimes there are younger people. Sometimes there is a grandparent figure. So you have all of these different people at different ages, and all of them are very appealing. And you have these very rounded, very complex characters. And for all of them, you have a fair amount of sympathy. So this is a book and also a television program, which I have to imagine is going to be a pretty serious skewering of the ultra wealthy. But what's happening here is Karen is arriving at this place, and it's incredibly opulent and incredibly over the top. And she understands, she's actually estimating, in fact, how much she thinks all of this costs at one point. But she's still very taken by it. So it's not just some satirical novel where she's just like tearing down these ultra wealthy people. In fact, Karen understands the allure, and Karen is very sort of sucked in to the fantasy of this kind of life. And Hildebrand does that again and again. So we have different people who could just be, a satirical send-up, and they could just be kind of an evil person, or they could just be completely off-put by something. But in fact, lots of them have these very complex and very real reactions. They're both kind of repelled and drawn to something, which is, I think, probably what we are going to also see in the television show. We're going to move on and look at another description of the island itself, and this is a little bit more about the nature. Throughout the novel, it's a close third-person narration, so it's a third-person voice. We're saying Tag did this and Karen did this, but it is following each of these people fairly closely. So before we were very much in Karen's point of view as we were arriving at the house, and now we are with Tag, who is the father of the groom. Tag paddles out to the Monomoy Creeks, a series of waterways that meander through reeds and eelgrass around floating islands and sandbars. It's peaceful here. The only sound is the plashing of his paddle against the surface of the water. Up above, an osprey soars, and in the distance, Tag spies sailboats, an approaching ferry, and commercial wharf. The sun is unseasonably warm for May. So Ellen, again and again in all of her books, does such a good job with these quick little descriptions that are very evocative of the island, often of nature, sometimes of the architecture. And some of my favorite descriptions are, in fact, of the interiors of the houses, just because she does it so incredibly well. And I can guarantee that we are going to have a lot of that in the television show. We've already seen it in the trailer. So it's pretty obvious all of the ways in which television is a visual medium, and all the ways that books are not, in fact, a visual medium. But what's maybe a little bit less obvious is the fact that dialogue, which is very much kind of the lifeblood of these Ellen Hilderbrand novels, I mean, not really. There are a lot of different things that kind of share the stage. But dialogue for television, certainly for kind of mainstream adaptations, really is in many ways the lifeblood of television. And Ellen Hilderbrand is so good with dialogue. So I want to take a look at a couple of different instances where her dialogue is so excellent, and where I think it'll be so fascinating to see how much of it translates verbatim into the television show. I have no idea. I can tell you that some of the lines that I saw in the trailer, it's ridiculous that I'm basing, sort of like half this lecture on like a 2.5 minute clip. And believe me, I know that clip inside and out by now. A lot of that writing was not, in fact, in the novel, but it is 2.5 minutes of what is going to be a 6-hour long series. So it remains to be seen how much of this dialogue and how much kind of the spirit of this dialogue is going to translate into the television show. But if I were someone who was acquiring intellectual property like this, I really would think that Ellen Hilderbrand would be a great place to start, because it's very visual, but also the dialogue is excellent. So one of the things that she does best with the dialogue is really tell us a lot about a wide swath of characters. And she does it very efficiently. So any of you writers out there, or even people who are, are just mere readers, dialogue should be doing so much work. It's not just, conveying information. In fact, it should almost never be conveying information. The most important thing it does is tell us a lot about the people who are speaking. I mean, also the information is important. And in fact, one of the kind of rules of writing, at least like literary fiction that you learn in an MFA program, is that it's really not good to have exposition in dialogue. So, exposition is simply kind of background information. So, you never want to have a character being like, hey, remember last night when you and I were at the park and you fell down and broke your leg? Well, I mean, that hopefully I would not ever have written that because just really sounded terrible. And in fact, Ellen does some of that. She violates some of these rules that you learn as a writer, but she does it so well and so effectively that it doesn't matter. The other reason why it feels very organic and very natural and very good, in fact, for her to be including a lot of background information is because of the nature of the investigatory novel. So we have this murder at the beginning, but then because we have these detectives and investigators and policemen, they're asking questions and they're seeking information, essentially backstory. So that seems very natural. And then people are giving a lot of information in the dialogue, but it doesn't feel too kind of heavy-handed. It's not too plodding. We don't have big long paragraphs worth of like where people were and what they were up to. The other thing that she does so well is whenever people are talking, you are learning a huge amount just from their word choice and from how they're speaking. All of that is telling you an enormous amount about who they are as people. So the first example we're going to look at is on page 26. So this is when Greer Winbury, the mother of the groom, is picking up the parents of the bride. So this is Karen and her husband Bruce, who have just arrived on the ferry, and Greer, who is played by Nicole Kidman, is picking them up. Greer, Karen says, "It's so nice to meet you. Thank you for having us. Thank you for everything." Bruce steps forward and offers Greer his hand. "Bruce Otis," he says. "It's a pleasure, ma'am." "Ma'am?" Greer says. She laughs with her head thrown back, her neck, still lovely but indisputably aged, exposed. "Please don't call me that. You make me feel 1,000 years old. Call me Greer. And my husband is Tag, like the game. After all, we're going to be family." So, a couple of really important things here. You have Karen and Bruce. We're going to talk about names in a minute. But Karen and Bruce could not be more different than Greer and Tag. And Tag is such an absurd name, in fact, that Greer has to say, like Tag, like the game. But you also have, right away, when we have this description of Greer, we have this emphasis on youth. She doesn't like it that he says ma'am because it makes her feel old. There's also this kind of intimacy that Greer is really forcing. These people have not met, and yet she's like, oh, we're going to be family. Don't call me that. She's in some senses kind of overly familiar with them. We also, this is again from Karen's perspective. So we also have this sense of Karen as noticing lots and lots of stuff. She's still in noticing mode. And what she's noticing, you can absolutely see Nicole Kidman. I mean, her neck probably looks perfect, but, laughing with the head back, all of these kinds of gestures. So that's basically a gloss. She starts talking, and then we have a description of her laughing with her head back. That's gloss is simply like, the words that come in the midst of a bunch of dialogue. So here the gloss is so telling because we both have Karen's perception of it, and then we also have not only what Greer is saying, but also the gestures that are accompanying this dialogue. It's so strong, and it's very telling in lots of ways. It's also noteworthy that this is the end of a section. We have a section break right after that. Greer says, "After all, we're going to be family." And there's an exclamation mark, and then you have blank space. So already there's some sort of tension building because of these kind of cliffhangery section endings that she is so good at, and we're going to delve more deeply into soon. On page 42, we're going to look at a different example here of dialogue. This is one of those very good examples where kind of the rules about how you're not supposed to include exposition in your dialogue, why those rules are so effectively broken, because in fact, this is an investigation. But still, as I'm reading, take note of how well you are beginning to know these people just because of what they are saying. The first speaker here is the chief of police. "Tell me what you saw when you got here," the chief says, "from the beginning." "I pulled in about 5:45, Roger says. The rental company was supposed to leave 17 rounds and 175 folding chairs. I wanted to double check the numbers, see how the dance floor settled, make sure there hadn't been any after-hours partying, standard stuff." "Understood," the chief said. "As soon as I got out of my car, I heard screaming," Roger says, "and I realized right away that it was Celeste. I thought something had happened to her mother." Roger pauses. "Celeste's mother, Karen Otis, is very sick, cancer." So this is we are learning so much here, but it also is coming in this voice, in the case of Roger, who is a very good example of how we are seeing this very wide swath of characters. So here we have someone who is an events planner. He does a lot of the weddings on the island. He also used to be like a contractor or something. And we have this very good thing. One of the things that Ellen Hilderbrand does very well is she uses all of these very telling terms of art. So, like when he says, the rental company was supposed to leave 17 rounds. That's something that wouldn't necessarily it wouldn't mean a lot to me out of context. I don't know what 17 rounds mean if you hear it about a rental company. But because of the context, we understand that he means round tables. And then we are very flattered as readers because we're like, oh, I get it. I see what's happening here. And we have this very natural way that Roger is speaking. It's almost like there's a certain shorthand that he and the police chief are using, but it is a shorthand that's also very obvious to the reader. It's so smart because it makes the people feel very real and it makes the dialogue feel very real and very natural. And this is the kind of thing you would absolutely want to see in the television adaptation. And I imagine together with the visuals, they'll be able to do even more of this than Ellen Hildebrand can here. We're going to look at a little more dialogue on page 69. So this is a conversation between Nick, who's another one of the investigators, and Abby, who is the bride's future sister-in-law. She is the daughter-in-law of the Nicole Kidman character, whose name, both in the novel and in the movie, is Greer. Okay, so this is Abby. She's played by Dakota Fanning, who I love. She's pregnant. Okay, on page 69, this is Nick, the investigator, talking. This is very, very important. Please think. It was late. Late like midnight, Nick says, or late like 4 a.m. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't know. Here, Abby tears up. I didn't know this would happen. Please don't get upset, Nick said. Let me find you some tissues. I'm fine, Abby says. And then, almost to herself, she says, I can't believe this is real. It's real. Merritt is dead. Abby, I have to ask, did you hear anything else in the middle of the night? Did you hear anyone in the water? There was a two-person kayak down by the beach. Abby's head snaps up. A kayak? That would be Tag's. You're sure? Yes, Abby says. Tag has two kayaks and he treats them like they're his babies. They're handmade by some guy in Alaska or wherever kayaks were invented. Tag has a one-person kayak and a two-person kayak, and when he invites someone out on the two-person kayak, it's really a big deal. It's a really big deal. Like an even bigger deal than when he invites you into his study to drink his 1,000-year-old scotch. So this is so good. First of all, even at the very top, when she says it was late, and then Nick says late like midnight or late like 4 a.m, that's the kind of dialogue that you almost feel like it would be difficult for the reader to understand that on some level. And of course, it's not. Like that's exactly late like midnight or late like 4 a.m. That's a very spoken kind of dialogue. And that's one of the things that Ellen Hilderbrand does so well. And then we have Abby, she's showing tears and she's reminding us as readers on page 69 that in fact, Merritt, the maid of honor, is dead. So you're having some emotion, which is important because it's adding verisimilitude. It's making the scene feel real. But then when these kayaks get mentioned, her head snaps up, which is, of course, very cinematic. And then we have this discussion of the kayaks that just killed me. So this is obviously exposition. And it's one of the clues that if we are reading this book as a mystery, which we should be, it's one of the clues that's kind of important. But I love the way that she says Tag has two kayaks and he treats them like they're his babies, which makes you wonder about his relationship with his actual sons. By the way, in the book, there are two sons, Thomas and Benjamin. In the television series, there's an extra son, Will Winbury, and I don't actually know anything about Will. I don't know why we have him. I don't know his role, but I'm kind of intrigued. It's excellent. So we have this idea that these are very precious to him. The fact that he's someone who's precious about kayaks is also really telling us a lot about, at least for me, like how off-putting this character is. And then we have the sense that Abby, who is, in the trailer, she says the secret to this family is to stay on the edges or the periphery or whatever. You can tell that she's a little judgy because she says they're handmade by some guy in Alaska or wherever kayaks were invented. That it's funny. So this is this kind of dark humor that I really hope and I expect that we will see a lot of in the television series. My sense of the trailer is that it was very well done, incredibly well stylized, and really a lot of dark humor right from the get-go. We have more exaggeration down with the 1,000-year scotch. So we have this sense of Abby as being someone who is also, she's of the family, but she's also a little bit on the periphery, which is an excellent vantage point for any character, and certainly one who is offering up this kind of snappy and really illustrative dialogue. We're going to look at one more example of dialogue. So this is another one of those examples of this wide swath of characters. Here we have a taxi driver who is talking to the police chief. The taxi driver's name is Bob. "The Wawinit," Bob said. "The real handsome kid in the red shorts and the blazer. I picked him up down at the steamship. He had a ticket for the 6:30 slow boat this morning, but I guess he missed it. And so he asked me to take him back to Monomoy. He said he was staying there." "You're sure you picked him up at the steamship dock?" the chief says, "and not at the Wawinit?" "Sure, I'm sure," Bob says. "I may not be getting any younger, but I have yet to make a 12-mile mistake." So I love that. A 12-mile mistake is so evocative. At first, as the reader, you're like, what's a 12-mile mistake? And then you realize, in fact, that the breadth of that the breadth or the width or something, it's a very small island. I think it's like 14 miles long or something, which these kinds of like little things that we are hearing in the dialogue are constantly reminding us of how the place is. I also like even that expression, "sure, I'm sure," that sounds very much to me like an older gentleman, maybe kind of a Yankee type person. I don't know why I'm into like the New England Yankee thing, but it feels very much kind of like this kind of old, salty seafaring town would be. So I love that idea that we have Bob, who's, he's not a character we're going to know very well, but he's giving us little subtle reminders of what Nantucket is all about, the size and the scope, but also giving us very important clues that we should be, holding on to about the goings on of one of the characters who is, in fact, under a lot of scrutiny. So with Bob, the taxi driver, and Roger, the wedding planner guy, I've given you a sense, and also people like Greer and visitors like Karen, I've given a sense of this very, very wide swath of characters. And part of that is simply because we are, it's a police procedural. I think that's what you call it. It's a thriller. It's a detective book. It's a mystery. So we have our police chief, who is in some ways kind of the quarterback and who is bringing us into all of these different spaces. And we have all of these very colorful people who really do feel like rounded characters. So, one of the reasons why I think they feel rounded is because sometimes they have these really elaborate names. Now, this is one of those things in the beginning I was a little critical of Elin, because there's an adage in writing, and I think this is one reason why people bog down in certain books, is if you are giving your reader too many details and the reader is like, oh my God, do I have to remember this, that, and the other thing? It can really weigh them down. The thing they used to tell us is it's like you have to imagine your reader has a backpack and every detail is like a rock they're putting in the backpack. And so you really only want to give them rocks or details that are in fact really salient, that are really going to move the story forward, or that are really going to tell you a lot about a certain character. So when she would have these elaborate names for the characters, I'm like, am I supposed to remember that Marty Skursurba is like some important person? I actually don't even remember who Marty Skursurba is, but I have it written down here. That's an excellent one because, oh no, you know who he is? He's like the guy who manages the airport, which is obviously, kind of a big, important job. And it's very cool. The things, she has like a whole description of fog and like why fog works and why Nantucket is apparently so foggy all the time, which is very cool. That you end up feeling like you've learned a thing or two when you read an Elin Hilderbrand novel. But in the case of Marty Skursurba, it's like lots of consonants all strung together. And so in parentheses, she gives you the pronunciation. So part of me could be critical and be like, we don't really need to have such an elaborate last name for this very minor character. But what I would argue, after having gotten a little deeper into the Elin Hilderbrand universe, is that these names are in fact very telling. And it's not always because of their, family heritage, even just the sound of the names. So in the book, Ed Capanash is the police chief. And I did like a lot of research to see like what national heritage Capanash comes from. And in fact, I only came up with Capanas, and I think that was like Scottish or something, but it was like not a very popular one. And there are a bunch of other names that sound like Capanash. But I honestly think that Elin may have made that name up because, in fact, she wanted something that sounds, catchy and something that you can remember, but also has a certain, I don't know if to me, it feels like a little bit either Eastern European or maybe British and Scottish, but there's something about it that feels just like Ed Capanash should. But I will stand by the fact that sometimes she goes a little overboard. So in the novel, we have Merritt Monaco, and Merritt Monaco is the person who is murdered at the beginning of the story and also the beginning of the television show. She is the maid of honor. And to me, Merritt Monaco's a little bit over the top. The alliteration and Merritt and Monaco, like it seems both kind of cheeseball and also very elitist. In fact, she says, Merritt, like the Parkway, and you would have to either be from like Westchester County or Manhattan or Connecticut to know what the Merritt Parkway is. And at one point, Karen, who is the mother of the bride and comes from much humbler means in Pennsylvania, she doesn't understand what merit like the Parkway means. So again, that's another example of the kind of subtle critique that Elin Hilderbrand is often leveling, but also it's telling us about their social stations and about how merit assumes that everybody knows what the Merit Parkway is. Also in this book, one of the sort of second tier main characters is named Featherly, and it's spelled like feather and then Leigh. So that is one of those ones that's a little over the top as far as I'm concerned. Featherly is a family friend from England, and in the casting, it says Isabel somebody or other, and that she is a family friend. So my assumption here, and she's in like 4 of the 6 episodes or something. So my assumption here is that Featherly has changed into Isabel. And then we have, for example, in the book, Cordelia Darling, we have Shooter Uxley, we have Sage Kennedy. So I think sometimes these names are in fact evocative, and they do give us, a strong image of things, but sometimes I do think they're a little over the top. So I was very curious to see what they were going to do with the names in the series. This is where it was very helpful for me to have gone through the cast list. So Greer and Tagg and Thomas and Benjamin, Winbury, so all of those names stay the same, except that, of course, Will is an addition. It's important to note too that Winbury, so it sounds very snooty and kind of highfalutin, but also you have in there the word win. These are people who have essentially like won because in fact they are so moneyed and they live what looks like this very sort of dreamy, perfect life. But also you have the word bury, Bury. So you have this idea of things being buried. So yes, they have won, but you have this idea of things as being kind of ominous, this idea of burying things. That's the groom's family. And then in contrast, we have the bride's family. So that is Karen and Bruce Otis and their daughter Celeste. In the show, they all become the Sachs family, Sacks. So, and that is an Americanized spelling of Sachs, Schs, which is an Ashkenazi Jewish name in terms of its, its origins. So I think it's interesting that they're trying to introduce, I think, a slightly less waspy and kind of like a less Yankee New England kind of parochialism here, with this idea that one of the main families is in fact Jewish. We also, though, have a couple of names in the series seemed a little bit over the top or maybe like a little too on the nose. There's a character named Enid Collins. Enid, just that really speaks to me of like a spinster aunt or someone who's like kind of homely, to use like a Victorian word. And I don't know who this Enid Collins is, and I don't really know anything about the character, but it is a very evocative, it sounds very like Downton Abbey, but like from the downstairs, I think, Enid Collins, or not, maybe the upstairs too. My judging of these English characters is not perfect. Speaking of English sounding characters, one other character we have in the show is Bronwyn Canals. And that to me sounds both like kind of a porn name, like a stripper name. I don't know why. I think because of the canals part. I don't know. But Bronwyn Canals, again, is a very colorful name. So these are people who are more minor characters that we don't see in the trailer necessarily. At least I don't think we do. But they are still, we're sort of keeping, I think, in the trailer some of this over the top naming that is very much one of the things that Elin has throughout all of her works. It's also important to note that Ed Capanash gets changed into Dan Carter, and that his daughter Chloe, it is also Chloe in the book. So we have Chloe Carter and we have Dan Carter, and those are somewhat big players. They are also Black in the television adaptation, and they are not Black in the book. I have to say, at one point, there's discussion about Nick, who is one of the other investigators, as being of Cape Verdean descent. I think he says his mother is from Cape Verde. And I was interested in this connection between Cape Verde and Nantucket because in Swan Song there is also a somewhat main character who has family who are from Cape Verde, and honestly, it was a little bit shocking to me and kind of a drag because of course when you look up the connection between this small New England shipping island and an island that is off the coast of Senegal, the first kind of record of the exchange had to do with the slave trade. So that was very, very problematic for me. I think the way that Elin keeps bringing up characters who have this Cape Verdean descent, I think that is a nod to a phenomenon where in the beginning of the 20th century, people were, they'd grown up on an island and were very used to lots of shipping jobs. And a lot of those people came here actually to work in the cranberry bogs, which were a very big, industry on the island. So, those of you who have tuned into the Fox page in the past know that I love watching people misbehave. I love books where people are making bad decisions. I really love television where all of this is happening and movies. I also am a real sucker for the skewering of the ultra wealthy. And that is absolutely something that I am expecting this television adaptation to do. I'll reiterate what I said quickly before, which is that we actually have a lot of sympathy for a lot of these characters. And this amazing third person narrator who follows the different characters along is really neutral in lots of ways, which is incredibly difficult to do. And Hilderbrand does a great job of it. Someone like Karen, who we are returning to again because she's at the beginning of the book and I won't spoil anything for anyone. She is both drawn in by, the luxury and the sumptuousness and the ease with which the ultra wealthy operate, but she's also a bit off put. And I really loved the fact that at the beginning of the book, as she is coming onto Nantucket Island, we have Karen doing this kind of calculation that is very edifying for the reader. On page 18, very early in the book, we have Karen's description of what she is seeing from the ferry. So this is even before she has met Greer and then driven up to Summerland, their house. So on page 18, she's describing the houses along the harbor. Some have lush green lawns that roll right up to the stone walls before a thin strip of beach. Every home flies the American flag, and all are impeccably maintained. There isn't a dumpy or disheveled renegade in the bunch. Money, Karen thinks. Where does all the money come from? She's seasoned enough to know that money can't buy happiness, and it certainly can't buy health. But it's still intriguing to contemplate just how much money the people who own these houses must have. First off, these are second homes, so one must account for the first home, a brownstone in Manhattan, or a brick mansion in Georgetown, an estate on the main line, or a horse farm in Virginia, and then factor in the price of waterfront property here on this prestigious island. Next, Karen considers all of the furnishings such houses must contain: the rugs, the sofas, the tables and chairs, the lamps, the pencil post beds, the 9,000 thread count Belgian sheets, the decorative pillows. Celeste has educated Karen beyond the world of Yankee Candle. There are apparently candles that sell for over $400. Celeste's future sister-in-law, Abby, gave Celeste such a candle as an engagement present. But when Celeste told Karen that a Joe Malone pine and eucalyptus candle sold for $470, Karen hooted. That was nearly as much as Bruce had paid for his first car, a 1969 Chevy Nova. So we have this excellent sort of contemplation about what kind of wealth are we actually talking about? And there is some exaggeration. I don't think you can have 9,000 thread count sheets. I don't know, maybe you can. I also don't know what a pencil post bed is, but this is the kind of description that you just can see it sort of all. I mean, even if you can't picture it exactly, the pencil post, you get a sense of what we are meant to envision here, this kind of opulence. And there's also a little nod, the people of the Yankee Candle Empire apparently have a house. It's been in the news recently. They have a house on Nantucket, some big old mansion. And I think, I don't know, I can't imagine the Yankee Candle people have fallen on hard times because those are everywhere in every CVS you ever go to. But it's a very Nantucket-y kind of thing to know about the Yankee Candle. It's also somewhat universal, again, because it's in every CVS. So there are lots of little tidbits that Elin Hilderbrand has throughout the book. And obviously, the whole point of this paragraph about candles is to talk about the absurdity of the ultra wealthy. Why is someone going to spend $470 on a Joe Malone little candle? And it's an excellent way to end this paragraph by mentioning that that is what Bruce's first car cost. All of this is to say that there is, I think, going to be some delicious skewering of the ultra wealthy in the television adaptation. I myself am hoping that that's going to be sort of one of the main thrusts. I think we see it. There's the younger guy in the trailer who is like, am I under arrest or can I go get something to eat? So you have this sense of this totally crazy entitlement of the wealthy. And certainly the over-the-top visuals are really pointing to the fact that we are going to be looking somewhat critically at the excesses of the ultra-wealthy. Not to mention one of them may have killed the maid of honor. But I am hoping that we're going to lean into this and we're going to end up with something that feels like, Succession or White Lotus or even like Knives Out or Triangle of Sadness Or, of course, Big Little Lies, in which Nicole Kidman was so excellent. And that certainly was a skewering of the ultra wealthy. I'm really hoping for that kind of emphasis in the adaptation. And if we are following the lead here from Elin, there's plenty of fodder. But again, Elin is pretty good at not making anybody too villainous, which is such an incredible skill. So we're going to talk very briefly about some of the structural elements that are in the novel that I think will translate so well to the screen. Then we're going to zip through a couple of my little quibbles, and then we will close. So one of the elements that I think is going to work really well, given the particular structure of this book, is the fact that even in the novel and also in the trailer, in the very, very beginning, we have this murder. And in the novel, we have the sort of front story, which is during the 4th of July weekend, Ed Capanash gets that phone call that there's a body floating in the water, which turns out to be Merritt Monaco. And then we have a couple of points in the past. So in the book, we toggle back and forth between this front story and a couple of instances of backstory. One is a bachelorette weekend that is also spent on Nantucket, where Merritt and Celeste, so the maid of honor and the bride, are meeting the groom's family. It seems a little bit contrived that the bachelorette weekend would be, at the second home of the groom. But you can also imagine that there is such like magnetic pull on the part of the groom's family that they're not only going to have the wedding, but they would also have the bachelorette weekend. So we have the front story, which is the night before the wedding, the murder occurs early that morning, and then we have the bachelorette weekend, and then we also go back further. So Celeste and Merritt met in New York City. They worked together at the Bronx Zoo. Benji is also in New York City. So we have quite a bit that happens in New York City. We have some stuff that's happening in Pennsylvania. We have some stuff that's happening in England. But it's this excellent parallel because in the novel, we have very clear divisions between the name of the person whose perspective we are following, and then the date and location oftentimes. So we're very well situated. So we know if we're at the front story with Ed Capanash or we're in the back story with like Featherly or someone. And what's so beautiful is that translates perfectly to the structure of television like this sort of adaptation, at least what I'm assuming. So, we have the front story of this murder scenes like the one where Liev Schreiber is in the jail. Apparently, the production team built what looked like a jail cell and an interrogation room with the one-way mirror. All of that was made in the basement of some bar, I think on Cape Cod. And the bar people really wanted to keep some remnants of the cell. But in fact, the production team, brought it all out. And it was as if it had never happened. But I love that kind of little detail about how all of that went down, underneath some establishment that was not, in fact, the Nantucket Police Department. But so my hope is that when we have in the trailer quick little flashes of like Dakota Fanning, who is pregnant, and she's saying to Celeste, that the best way to deal with this family is to stick on the periphery, you have a sense that probably happened during the bachelorette weekend. So we have the promise of a couple of different things. One is that that really beautiful thing where we have a front story and then we get lost in entire scenes that are happening in the backstory. But the other thing that's great about this structure, both in the novel and the adaptation, is that we're going to see a lot of Megan Fahey. So Megan Fahey plays the maid of honor, Merritt Monaco, in the adaptation. And my first concern when I saw it was like, oh no, if she's the one who dies, like, are we ever going to see her after she is murdered? And my sense is that yes, we are going to see her because I am fairly certain that we will have flashbacks, maybe not to New York City, but certainly to this bachelorette weekend. So it works incredibly well with television because as you're moving from scene to scene, you're going to move from that scene where Tag and Greer are being interviewed, you're going to move to a different scene, and maybe that's going to be the scene when Benji is saying Happy Wedding Eve to his bride, whose name is Amelia in the adaptation, but who is Celeste in the book. You can imagine just, as a television watcher and as a reader, how well those things are parallel. So any television scene, that's involving different people is very much like a scene in the book that is also focusing on a select few characters. I do have a sense that it is not going to be like a White Lotus thing where we have a body show up in the beginning and we don't know who died. That is such an excellent structure. It's like that in The Feast by Margaret Kennedy, this incredible novel. If you have not read it, you must read it. In the very beginning of the book, we have the aftermath where a bunch of people have died. Not a bunch, but like a handful. And we don't know who dies. And you're reading the entire novel and you're like, oh my God, please don't let it be these people. And then you're like, oh, I hope it's not these people. So I don't think this is going to be set up like that. Partly, again, because all of the Hilder babes who are like Ellen's, devoted fans, there's a wide swath of people who already know, in fact, what happens in the book, and you don't want them settling in for a television mystery when, in fact, it's very easy to find out who done it. One other thing that we are going to see, I am fairly certain, in the adaptation that is so well done in the novel are all of these different subplots. So we have this question. Karen is very sick. She is dying of cancer, and she knows that she isn't going to live much longer. And we learn in the novel fairly early on that she is contemplating suicide. So there's this question of like, is she in fact going to take her life, and when is she going to do it? I mean, it's a little tense because, of course, it is her daughter's wedding weekend. So you're kind of assuming it's not going to be anytime soon. But the fact that this idea is introduced adds a certain amount of tension to that subplot. We also have this question about whether or not there is something going on with Merritt Monaco and the certain person in the wider Winbury family. And that is something that is developed in the book that I hope is developed in the television show. We also have this whole subplot in the book where Greer has written a novel. She is a mystery writer, and it's actually so great. And I can't imagine they will have this in the television adaptation. But there are lots of references to retirement and to Greer sort of feeling like maybe her work is getting a little tired and maybe it's not her best. And wouldn't it be nice to be retired? Which, of course, as a fan of Elin, you are in 2024, you're looking back and thinking, okay, this is something she was thinking about, in 2017 when she was writing this book that was published in 2018. So it turns out that Greer, who is this writer, has done a very bad job with her most recent novel. So there's this question of whether or not she is going to have to redo the novel and what is going to happen with her career. We also, of course, have the question of Featherly. In the book, there is some history of infidelity between Featherly and Tag, who has had quite a history of infidelity. So all of these subplots that Elin Hilderbrand is developing so well in this relatively long novel. I'm really interested to see which of them are pulled out and developed in the television series, because of course there have to be some subplots along with this question of like who killed the maid of honor. Also, Elin Hilderbrand is so good at cliffhangers. What's great about these cliffhangers is sometimes she'll have them at the end, even of a section, and it won't be like a major cliffhanger, but it will be something that will absolutely make you turn the page. So whether it's the end of a chapter and it's some big thing, like at one point the chapter ends like, but then Celeste met Shooter Uxley. And you're like, oh my gosh, wait, what is up with Celeste and Shooter Uxley? So you have this sense in the book of just not being able to stop turning the pages. And the way that of course, manifests itself in television is that even when you're moving scene to scene, there's going to be a lot of tension. You'll be following some subplot, and it will come to some sort of conclusion, and we'll move to a different scene, and you will be left hanging. You'll be left thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen? I've got to keep watching because I'm invested in this particular subplot or this particular character. And then, of course, there will be some gigantic cliffhangers at the end of each episode, the same way that we have at the end of the chapters in the novel. The conjecture, by the way, the word on the street is that probably this will be a one-off. This will just be, there's not going to be a sequel, because in fact the book is a single story, and that we're going to, at the end, we are presumably going to learn who killed Merritt Monaco, and all the rest of the subplots will be all tied up. And I hope it will be very satisfying at the end, but along the way we will have lots and lots of these cliffhangers. The other thing about this kind of structure where we have the front story and the back story is it is so shocking in the book, and I'm hoping it will be like this in the television show, to go from some of the backstory pieces and then pop into the front story and remember that Merritt Monaco is dead. So you get very invested in Merritt Monaco in New York City and her friendship with Celeste. So you have a lot of investment, and you're really curious about how this young woman is going to grow and develop and what she's going to do with her life. And then you go back to the front story and you're like, oh my God, wait, right, she's dead. So I hope that is something that will be just as compelling in the television adaptation. We're going to take just a quick dive into some of my quibbles. And what was really fun, actually, was to realize that a few of these quibbles that I have about Ellen's work might be totally cured in the television adaptation situation. So one is the names. I've told you that they seem a little over the top to me, and I think some of them are a little toned down in the television adaptation, which would be great. Also, there's some use in the novel of cliche and some sort of tired tropes. And, that's a little troublesome for me here. Um, Lots of times, in fact, it's very effective. Lots of times, cliche works because it's a good shorthand and people understand it and it's very effective and familiar. But I think, oftentimes she has better ways to say those things. But I'm assuming that we won't see so many sort of cliche things. I mean, who knows? Maybe there'll be all sorts of cliche television, conventions in the adaptation. But from what I can tell, again, from that incredibly beautifully stylized and really dynamic and really taut and interesting trailer, we're going to see, a very sort of cutting edge and really high quality production with incredible writing and plotting and all the rest of it. So I'm hoping some of the cliche and tiredness is going to evaporate in the adaptation. We also, in the novel, have some kind of cringy descriptions of sex. And it's not very often that I find that I find her work very cringy, but there were a couple of descriptions in this book that I was like, oh my God, Ellen, no. And I'm actually going to read them to you because they're a little crazy. So on page 78, I'm not going to tell you who this is because I don't want to, give anything away. But you can just listen to the cringy sex description and just either like cringe yourself or just like enjoy. This is someone thinking about a woman. He thinks about lifting up her flimsy T-shirt, or better still, tearing the damn thing in half so he can lick the hard points of her nipples until she groans in his ear. I mean, not great, not great. I had a writing teacher, any of you have heard this, I had a writing teacher who was like, the best way to write about sex is simply describe what's going on. So this kind of, like listening to this person, have this fantasy is just, it's very difficult. Okay, moving on. On page 86, again, this is, I don't know why this cracks me up so much. It's really something. At the bottom of page 86, this is actually a chapter ending. Even that faintest touch of her lips sent a surge of electricity through him. He is pulsing with desire for her. He won't be able to stop himself from driving her to the beach and making love to her, maybe more than once. He is, ultimately, only a man. Okay, so a bunch of things here. One is that he is pulsing with desire for her. By the way, what I'm doing here is I'm taking out the names. I'm just putting in some pronouns so you don't know who I'm talking about. This is also fairly early in the novel, so I'm not spoiling anything. But this idea of the surge of electricity being sent through him, this is the kind of thing that my teacher would have advised you not to do. Just describe that they're kissing. Don't say that the faintest touch of her lips is sending electricity surging through him. And then this idea that he is pulsing with desire for her, wow, I mean, just not great, not great. Then we get to the really icky stuff about how he might have to like take her more than once. He is only a man. This is kind of excusing of really gross male behavior. That is something that we see throughout. There's a bunch of stuff that is really yucky in terms of like male entitlement and male sexuality. I think the way that Ellen would justify these things is that this is being told from the perspective of this man. So this is the way that this man would be thinking. Like he would be excusing his behavior because he's like, well, it's just, I'm just such a man. But I think that there probably were ways to work around that in the novel. My hope is that a lot of this kind of cringy sex description is going to be taken care of in the television adaptation, because obviously we are just going to see what's going on. We are not going to have any interiority about somebody just being like, oh, I can take her many times, or she wants to be taken by me because I'm a man. We won't have that kind of interiority. There may very well be really like gross macho, hypersexualized male stuff. Like that may be really, who knows, maybe that's like at the heart of the television adaptation. But at least we won't have to read it in somewhat cliched and slightly cringy terms. So another one of my little quibbles, and this actually comes up again and again in Ellen's work. So Ellen Hilderbrand herself, from what I can tell, must be a very, very broad, very wide and very ardent reader of literary fiction, because there is always a character in the book who is reading like a lot of literary fiction. So in Swan Song, during the course of one summer, this young woman reads like 17 different I'm exaggerating, but she reads a lot of these highly literary novels. And this is a young woman who has this incredibly demanding job on Nantucket all summer long. How it is that she also has happened to read like these 12 different books that she has read. And the books are always named. There's always like a paragraph somewhere in the novel that lists all of these highly literary books. In this case here, it was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern and Kristen Hanna, a book by her, and maybe The Goldfinch, maybe is the other one. But it's that kind of, contemporary literary fiction that one of the characters is always reading. And it drives me a little bit crazy because it always seems a little bit too obvious and kind of on the nose, and it's never quite right with the character. I think what people read is very indicative of them, but a list of what that person really loves to read, it just always seems a little bit too constructed and not very organic. So the reason why that isn't going to be a problem in the television adaptation is I don't really imagine that people are going to talk about what books they are reading, and we're not going to have anybody sitting reading a book. Don't get me wrong. Like in White Lotus, when those young girls by the pool are reading Freud and like Franz Fanon, like that's very indicative, and Nietzsche or whatever it is they're reading. Like there may be, in fact, examples of what people are reading. And it may be part of the skewering of the ultra wealthy, or maybe part of like the gross over sexualized male. I don't know. Maybe there are going to be a lot of books in this adaptation, but I don't really think so. The last thing I want to talk about is music. So Elin Hilderbrand, in all of the books that I've read, music has kind of a large presence. And I just have never been a fan of music named by title. Every once in a while it works, but when there's a lot of it, I either know the name of the song and I'm like kind of humming along, but I'll be like, wait, is it that one? Or wait, maybe, oh, what am I supposed to be feeling? Or even if it's something that I know really well, it's just like it takes me out of the story. Like suddenly I'm not in the prose anymore. I'm like singing the song, or I'm trying to remember when I, loved that song or hated that song or whatever it was. So it never quite works for me. And obviously if it's a song I don't know, then it just like doesn't, it's not a bonus. There's nothing good about it. So it's always awkward for me. And this is not just Elin Hilderbrand. I have this problem with all of music, like the idea of naming a name of a song. And that problem is also going to be solved because what I'm hoping is that we are going to have incredible music selection for the television series. Remember in Big Little Lies, they had all of that Alabama Shakes music that was so, so good. I'm hoping that it's going to be very, vibey when we get to the music selection. Even in the trailer, the way that they use music is incredible. There's that kind of big band song. I can't remember what it is right now. But there's all these sort of cymbal crashes, and we see Nicole Kidman, and then a cymbal crash, and we see Liev Schreiber, whoever it is. The music is used to incredible effect in the trailer. So I'm really hoping that that will carry over. Music is so, so important. I think you remember also from White Lotus, I heard an interview with Mike White, and he had just been on Survivor. If you liked White Lotus and you have not watched Mike White on actual Survivor, you should definitely do that. It's amazing. But he had been on Survivor, like the actual show. He was a contestant before he wrote White Lotus. And a lot of the music from White Lotus was, the sort of inspiration came from Survivor. And he said something about how he wanted it to feel in White Lotus like there might be a sacrifice at any minute. So I'm hoping that the music here is also going to have a real point of view and is going to be really evocative and really additive. So I think you can tell how excited I am about this. Maybe we should have a check-in after I have watched the television series. But because of Elin Hilderbrand's excellent structuring, which is going to work so well in the television, the sense of place, the incredible description, the dialogue, these wide swaths of characters, all of the different subplots, all of that I hope is going to add up to what is going to be a very satisfying and very entertaining skewering of the ultra wealthy. The cast looks incredible. The production looks incredible. I'm just really, really excited about it. And I hope that today's discussion of all of the attributes of Elin Hilderbrand's work is wetting your whistle and getting you excited about watching the series when it comes out on September 5th. So happy reading and happy TV watching.